Right now, the director of the History Center, Daniel Schlegel, has a couple of words to say.
All right, Happy New Year, everybody. It's great to see everyone's faces again. We are quite busy, as you can imagine, at the History Center. We have some new exhibits coming up, and we are quite excited. We're taking down 2 old exhibits right now that were temporary. We have one coming up called The Anatomy of a Quilt. I have some flyers for anyone that's interested over at the table where I usually am. It's the Showers Brothers quilt. The ladies of the Showers family made this quilt after the factory burned down as a way to raise funds for the employees who were out of work while they rebuilt the factory. And it both talks about the quilt. There's some really neat conservation that we're doing to it as well to help save and preserve it, which is part of what we do. So this exhibit will talk a little bit about that. So whether or not you're a big quilter, I'm not. I know how to use a quilt. I'm really good at that part. But I can appreciate some really good conservation work and the history of it. So if you're interested in that, this is going to be a fantastic exhibit. And the other item I had, and I was only able to get it from Hillary, our curator, under penalty of death. So, but I have a very, very small miniature version of one of the panels from the Alexander Memorial. We have an exhibit going up about that. But since we can't have the memorial in the History Center, it's a little too heavy for our floors, we're having 3D models created of some of the panels that were just redone. And it looks excellent over there at the courthouse. We go into more of the history about it, including Alexander's will that dictated his estate would go toward creating the monument. So we'll have his will on display as well for everyone to see. This is a very small model, I'm sure, as everyone can tell. So some of the items, because of the cost with 3D printing, ours will be 18 inches high. So a little bit bigger than this one, but it's going to be a really neat exhibit, especially because of all the work that just happened to restore that monument. So that will open up later this month. So I will be back at the January 31st meeting with the exact timing, but it will run through June. So there'll be plenty of time. I'll mention it several more times in that time frame. But make sure to keep an eye out and come out and see us. And then we are very excited because of Dr. Robison's talk today. So I have some other books that relate to to rail lines. And then with next month's speaker, we have some books related to that and some general Indiana ones. So a lot of neat stuff over there. And if you haven't been out to the History Center lately, give us about a week after we take down the old exhibit and you'll see some neat stuff coming up. So make sure you swing by, come out and see us. Or if you need some last second gifts because you didn't get what you wanted for Christmas, come out and see us. We have some neat stuff out there. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the talk today.
Thanks, Daniel. Looking to the future, we've got program scheduled through October of this year. So I feel good about that. Our next program will be January 31st. Al Parker, a wildlife biologist, will give a program on the history of the bald eagle reintroduction to Lake Monroe. And then February 28th, that will mark our 10th anniversary of being in existence. It'll be a program by James Krause on the Indiana Theater, or better known now as the Buskirk Chimney, at 100 years old. March 28th, Hillary Fleck of the Monroe County History Center will present highlights from the Herald Times photo collection. The Herald Times donated all their old negatives to the History Center some time back. And she's going to show a lot of what they found. April 25th, John Bayton will give a program on what would it be like to walk through the streets of Bloomington more than 100 years ago. To me, that's fascinating. The Rediscovering Bloomington project seeks to answer these questions and more. May 30th, Susan Snyder Salmon will give a program on the history of dry stack stone walls in Monroe County. These are all over the county. June 27th, James Capshew, who's the official Indiana University historian, I believe, will give a program on the life and times of Herman B. Wells of IU. July 25th, the History of Bloomington Cats TV, our guys that film all this, they've been in operation for over 45 years, and they're going to tell you a lot of what they've done in the past. August 29th, Christine Friesel will give a program on what she says is the Duncan family and mechanics band of the late 1800s. Not sure what that's about, but we'll find out. September 26th, Rod Spa will give a program on the local Feltus family and their family newspaper, which was a weekly paper, a lot of you may recall. And then the new one we just added, my friend Clay Stuckey, Dr. Clay Stuckey, will give a program on the history of the campus of the old Bloomington High School. Now that's something I think a lot of people will be interested in. We went to the old school, a lot of us. The old school. It brings us to today. We have Dr. Roger Robison is going to give a program on the traction terminals of Indianapolis. So there he is, Dr. Robison. Hold it or put it in there?
Hello. You can hear me, I guess. This was the traction terminal when I discovered it. Do any of you here remember the bus station? A few. Okay. This became the bus station in 37 and until 68, and then it was torn down. And the tracks were there, but you can't see them. And the traction terminal existed from 1904 to 37, even before my time, and I'm probably the oldest one here, so I don't imagine too many of you remember it. What is traction? Somebody asked me the other day. Well, it's mass transport. And originally, of course, and still, steam, electric, or petrol, take your choice. This was the original building built in 1904 by Burnham from Chicago. And it was a beautiful structure, consisted of the car barn, the terminal building, this is Illinois Street, this market, and then these were office buildings. There it is identified for you. This office building was up here, and this was the lower 2 floors terminal, and this was the car barn. And traction in the 19th century was a toss-up. We had steam railroads originally, and miles of track increased tremendously. So by the fin de siècle, you had 200,000 miles of track. Electric trams started 1884 in Germany. Streetcars came about, electric streetcars, 1890s. And the traction terminal then was 1904. Motor cars and steam, electric, and petrol were the three competing methods of motor cars. Oil was discovered in 1859. Duryea Brothers, cabs in London. Stanley Steamer was prominent between 1892 and 1900. And at the turn of the century, most of the automobiles were steam. 40% were steam, 38% electric, and only 22% used petrol. And all that changed with the Model T Ford. Petrol won. This was an early tram, the first one, attributed 1884 in Germany. And this is what Indianapolis looked like about the turn of the century. And you have horses and lots of horse manure and electric streetcars after horse-drawn originally, and then electric took over about 1890. And this is what downtown Indianapolis would look like about the turn of the century. Electricity. Edison said, we'll make electricity so cheap only the rich can afford to burn candles. And here's an electric car. And here's Edison holding up the hood there. There's about 12 batteries in there. And that's one of the early electric cars. Nowadays, rich people restore these things. This is a Detroit model electric vehicle, 1919. This is a Milburn, 1921. And here are the batteries. You had 7 batteries in the back and 7 in the front. So this particular car only had 14 batteries. Some cars had as many as 30 batteries. Here's the back end of the Milburn where the batteries went. And these were nice for little old ladies who didn't want the stink and the smell of gasoline, and you know, it's like an electric lawnmower. You know, no spark plugs, no carburetor, no noise. And so they were very popular, and guess what they now are, you know? Well, the interurban, this was transport between towns. It connected adjacent towns. Interurban was a term used. Have any of you ever heard that term, interurban? Few of you? Okay. And this was our traction terminal put up in 1904 because we had 5 traction companies. And since 1890, electric streetcars going from town to town and was the rage. And here's Illinois Street, here's Market, here's the car barn, terminal building, office building, and here's the state capitol. Now, here's the situation. What? Situation here. Here's the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, and here's the State House. So this is on Market Street between these 2 landmarks in Indianapolis. And it took up a whole block from Market to Ohio. Here's the State House at one end, and here's a car pulling in to the car barn. And there's the Capitol there on the west. And here's the barn. Here's a car pulling in. And here's at the other end. This is 1940. But here's the Soldiers and Sailors Monument. By this time, since 37, it was also a bus station. This was the Indiana Railroad. This was the last vestiges of this system. Died in 40, 41. It's one of the last cars. And here it is today. And we see the State House. And instead of the traction terminal, there's a hotel here. And this is the hotel now that it takes the place of where this used to be. It's on Illinois and Market. And this is replaced. It was after they tore it down in 1970. It was a Blue Cross Blue Shield for a while, and now it's a hotel. Around the country, we were number 2 in trackage. Ohio led with 2,800 miles of track. Indiana was second. Pennsylvania, and Illinois, California, New York. These were the big 8 major states. 22 states had very few mileage, less than 500 miles. And 30 states had these traction lines, meaning electric streetcars that went from town to town. These are not just streetcars, but interurban streetcars. And so there were only 30 states involved, only 8 major. And why? Well, you needed a flat surface for these babies because if you're going to climb up mountains, you know, it's going to take more energy than you got. So here's glaciers. The recent one was the Wisconsin glacier. And you can see that flattened out most of Indiana and Ohio and Minnesota and New York. Pennsylvania was the outlier, but even though Pittsburgh is hilly, they had a lot of these interurbans there. And so these are the main states, though, that are flattened out. And where it was flat, you could run these babies, but you not only had to have a flat surface, you had to have some people. And southern Indiana was not full of people. There weren't a lot of people going to pay money to go from Bedford to Bloomington or from Bedford to Seymour. So the southern part of the state here was not involved with this. And Ohio was the big state. And but Ohio had multiple centers, whereas Indiana, the main center was Indianapolis. And we had 12 different lines coming into Indy. 5 different companies had 12 different lines. So even though Ohio had more trackage, theirs was divided up, Cincinnati and Dayton and Columbus, whereas we had everything centralized on Indianapolis. One of the strange places was California. Only had 1,300 miles of interurban track, and 1,000 of it was L.A. And L.A., of course, is a natural here. This is flat. L.A. is surrounded by mountains. But within that there was a lot of flat land, and you connected this. And it's only 1,000 miles. And, of course, this is the premier system today. They're still in business. And but at this time, there weren't any people living there. You know, 1900, So California was promising, but not the big center it is today. So here's the glacier, and the last glacier, the Wisconsin, came down here. Now here's Bloomington, here's Indianapolis, and the previous glacier was the Illinois, and it flattened things down around here and on this side, so it was flat here, and the Wisconsin one really flattened things out. So there were two glaciers, but Bloomington didn't get flattened out. It's hilly here, and it's full of clay and limestone, and there weren't a lot of people living down here, so it didn't really extend down here. And to this day, you can go and find, you can see Martinsville and Bloomington, there's a difference in the geology of where the glacier flattened things out. And so the interurban extended to Martinsville, but did not get to Bloomington. Now, we had 12 lines that came into Indianapolis, and that's why they decided to build the traction terminal for all these things to make it easier to access downtown Indianapolis. So there were 12 different lines coming into town, and there were 5 companies. Now, these are private companies. Today, of course, this is all financed by government money, but this was private enterprise. And these were companies, and the big two were Union and Terre Haute. The Union company was in the gas belt, Anderson, Muncie, Marion. They had 3 different lines, the Terre Haute, Indianapolis, and Eastern. Terre Haute, Lafayette. Terre Haute went to Indianapolis, then north to Lafayette, or you could go on over east to Richmond. So you go from border to border on the THINE. They had 6 lines. You had the Indiana Service Corporation, which was a rare group, ran through my hometown. It was a rare east-west connection, connected to Frankfort, Kokomo, Marion, where it connected to the Fort Lane lines. Indianapolis and Cincinnati, it never got to Cincinnati, but it was handy to go to Connorsville, Greensburg, Shelbyville. And then you had a line to Louisville. So these were the companies that, and this is how they approached Indianapolis. The streets they came in on, all headed for downtown Indianapolis, 12 different lines. And here they are, here are the companies. And Union was over here in the gas belt. The Terre Haute went coast to coast, border to border. This went up to Fort Wayne. There was a connecting route. And this went, the big one here was the Dixie Flyer, went from Indy to Louisville. And this is how another map of the different lines. And you see that this area of the state was not serviced by these units. They came as far south here as Martinsville, and over here they went down to Sullivan. But nothing south of that. This was not an area where they're going to sell a lot of tickets, and it's not an area that's particularly flat. The one through line went on to Louisville and was heavily trafficked, as was the one to Fort Wayne. Kind of, okay. And these were the 2 big ones, Union and Terre Haute, and they both each had about 400 miles of track. And again, this is northern Indiana, and unless you lived up there, you wouldn't know about these because they didn't involve the towns here in southern Indiana. And so this was the Union, and this was the Terre Haute. And so you could get all around. And the premier basketball league, the first basketball conference in the state, was North Central Conference. And Anderson and Muncie and Lafayette and Kokomo, et cetera, Frankfort, were all connected by interurban. And that's one of the things that made it possible for them to have the first conference in Indiana. The traction terminal then was built to service all these lines. And they had room for 9 tracks. And again, we had 5 companies. And the Terre Haute had 3 coming in. 1 from the Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Cincinnati, which never got to Cincinnati. They merged into 1 track. The Terre Haute had 6 lines that merged into 3 tracks. Louisville was one, and I got the wrong button. And Jesus, I'm really screwed up. And the talk's over. Jesus. What the hell did we hit? I think I'm going the wrong way. I give up. Wrong way. Maybe, huh? Okay. Yeah. I only have 4,000 slides. Jesus. Well, I don't know what's wrong here. Probably, yeah. Okay. I guess so, yeah. Okay, so we had 5 different companies coming in. And here again, there's the train shed, terminal building, office building. And here's what this occupied a whole block. And the storage facilities here, freight lines, and they had retail businesses sold along here. Here's the car barn. And now you had 9 lines coming in. And so you had freight over here kept, you had retail business. And you had coming in from the south, you had about 5 and 4 from the north. So they came in different ways. Tracks came in different ways, north and south, and that's how the 9 were divided up. And tracks 1 and 4 were coming in, and 5 and 9 were going out. And here's a picture of what it looked like at the time, because it's got these ugly overhead wires. There's the Soldiers and Sailors Monument. And so the people coming in, this is the south side, they were entering the car barn, and the other units were coming out over here. And so the tracks 1 to 4 were the Union and the Fort Wayne line. They entered from the southeast side. Indianapolis and Cincinnati entered, was track number 5, entered from the north. Track number 6 was the Louisville. The Dixie Flyer entered from the north. And the Terre Haute had 7, 8, and 9 entrance. And here's a picture of them, Union. And here's the ones coming out. You can see these are the front, 1, 2, 3, 4. These are coming out. It's the Terre Haute line, Fort Wayne, and Louisville, and the Union here next there. And this was lighted by natural light. These weren't solar panels. And this was business. These trains left every hour, and you're paying 2 or 3 cents a mile. And there were 500 million people a year service these trains. And so this was a huge business in Indianapolis at the time. Again, here's the lighting, and the different tracks were allotted. And here's a color picture of it at the time. And here's cars coming in and out of the station in 1910 with and here's an interesting hotel here. That's the Bates which, Hotel right across from the station. And all right, Sam Insull got involved with the Indiana traction companies. Insull was from a lower middle class family in London. His dad was a reformer, politician, and but he got a political placement in the vicinity of Oxford, so that Insull, when he was 14 years old, got to go to the prep school, the academic prep school, what the Brits call public school and we call private school, when he was a teenager. And he never went to college, but he got this tremendous public school education. And so while the rich kids went on to Oxford, he went to work. And he was an office boy as a teenager, became a stenographer, ended up working for the Edison Company, and was so good at 21, he ended up working for Edison. And he ended up in the United States. And Edison was a great inventor, but didn't know how to add or keep books. He's also deaf as a post. But anyway, he's working for Edison and keeping the books, and he became Edison's #1 man. And he had a big deal in the formation of General Electric. Well, J.P. Morgan and the banks took over GE and pushed Edison out, which was fine with Edison because he got a lot of money, and he continued inventing. And looked like Insull was going to take over the General Electric, but he was passed over. So he took over in Chicago instead, took over Chicago Edison in 1890. He was 32 years old, and he's head of all the Edison electricity in Chicago. Well, he takes over and makes a lot of money. And he merged all these electric facilities and took over public service, electricity and gas, 300 cities. And he took over Midwest Electric and Gas, 500 terminals in 32 states, expanded to 39 states. And so he's expanding Mattoon, Charleston, Chicago People's Gas. Well, you got to sell the electricity to somebody, so he got involved in the traction business. They got all this electricity they're making, so they want to sell it to the electric streetcars. So he's in all these states: St. Louis, Pennsylvania, Oregon, New England, Oklahoma, Texas, blah, 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 blah. He's in 39 states. And Midland was what the name of the company that was controlling interurbans in Indiana. He's also responsible for Lake Schaefer and Lake Freeman. Now, that's not around here, but some of you have heard of that, I take it. Remember Lake Schaefer, Lake Freeman. And that started by some farmers. Here he is, head of all these plants in 27. And there he is. Now, he bore a remarkable resemblance. Screwed this up again. Remarkable resemblance to the Monopoly guy. When they invented Monopoly, they kind of put his picture on there. And these dams, Lake Schaefer and Lake Freeman, which some of you, if you got out of Monroe County, may be aware of, but they were built by farmers, and he took them over to generate hydroelectric power for the interurbans. And of course, this created Lake Schaefer, Lake Freeman, which is still in business. They used to have a dance hall up there. Those of us from northern Indiana used to go there to hear the big bands. And Insull was involved in several of the Indiana interurbans. And he ran the one to Louisville, the Dixie Flyer. This Northern Indiana Power connected Terre Haute to the system, to the Fort Wayne system, and this ran through my hometown. This was Frankfort to Kokomo to Marion, one of the rare east-west lines. He also ran the Fort Wayne to Indy line, and he ran the South Shore in Chicago. Some of you have ridden the South Shore or know about the South Shore. It's still in existence, one of the few light rail, and it's still around. And so this was the Insull properties. And again, there's nothing down here in this corner or over here. But he did have the Dixie Flyer to Louisville, and he had the Fort Wayne, and he connected to that tear out. And here's a Dixie Flyer leaving the train terminal. This was an interesting place. This was a bar, tavern, hotel. And this was like Alice's restaurant. You could get anything you wanted there. I can verify that. And here's the Dixie Flyer out on the road, or you could travel by bus. It was a lot cheaper to go on the Dixie Flyer. And you had these parlor car, buffet, dining car, or you could sleep. You could have a sleeper on your way to Louisville. This was deluxe travel for 2 or 3 cents a mile. And this was, the common ones ran every hour. These babies ran every hour. This was a more deluxe. It didn't quite run that often, but it ran frequently. 8 fast trains a day to Louisville, and you could have a sleeper on the way. And these were the sleeping compartments. And this South Shore, still in business, and that ran from Chicago to South Bend and all along the lake here. Frank Leahy used to live in Beverly Shores. Beverly Shores, a famous stop. The House of Tomorrow's 1933 Chicago World's Fair. They had 10 House of Tomorrow, futuristic houses. When the fair closed, the Columbian Exposition closed in 33, they moved most of the houses to Beverly Shores, and they're still over there. You can buy one if you're willing to keep it up. A lot of University of Chicago professors used to live in Ogden Dunes, in and out there. And this still runs. Now at South Bend, it's got a nice connection, the nice South Bend Airport that Bulig or whatever his name constructed there. It's a nice airport. And also this South Shore stops there, and also buses to O'Hare and Midway. So it's still viable. And here's the famous Beverly Shores, and Insull designed this station there. Beverly Shores, still a nice place to live, and has those houses of tomorrow. And it was a good deal, and here are people riding it, good service, and dining car. And here are these posters that went up, and you can buy a book of these about the dunes, and Insull did it upright, publicized it, and this was to attract people to use the South Shore. Well, in 1929, as some of you know, the market collapsed. You've heard of that, right? Yeah, some of you have heard of that. There's nobody here that lived through it. I don't think any of you lived through it. Anybody around living in? No. So, you know, oops, screwed up again. This thing does not go backwards. Help. Daniel, where are you? It won't go backwards. No, it doesn't. It won't go backwards. One more. No, one more. Good. Stop. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so the market hit a high of 381. It wouldn't get back there for 25 years, 1954. So they talk about the market crash like it was one day. Well, it wasn't one day. And it started falling on October, and October 24th, it was down 11%. And then another 13% next Monday. Next Tuesday, it was down 230, and it nadired in 32. Well, and here's the market as, you know, it was going great here, and then it started to fall a little bit, see? So this is history book stuff to most people, but not in my family. This is my father, who retired in 1927. And EHR here, my dad, he was doing so well in the market. He was single, divorced, living it up, and he was in the market. And like a lot of shoeshine boys and elevator boys, he was playing the market. And he got so far ahead, he retired. He was about 30-some. And he bought a yacht, and this is him on his yacht in Lake Michigan. And he's a little 32-footer, wasn't very big, and he had a little crew to help him sail it to Benton Harbor, and he's living it up, date bait, you know. and he's taking night classes at the University of Chicago, and he's living at the hotel here, the Bismarck, and having a good time, room service. And he ended up, after the crash, at the YMCA. And he's ends up cooking on a hot plate. In the meantime, he had decided to go to optometry school. So he had signed up in September of 29. And they said, do you want to pay for the whole year? And he said, oh, no, I'll just pay a month at a time. Well, like I say, he ended up cooking on a hot plate. Anyway, most of the interurbans died. A few of them survived. These died as late as 58. The one, LA, the Long Beach, is 60. And there were still interurbans in LA. And if you watch old movies, if you watch TCM, Film Noir, see some of these old 40s movies from LA, you'll see pictures of the car barns in LA in the 40s. And they didn't completely phase out until 60. And they're the leaders now in this light rail. And South Bend Shore survived, as did one in Cleveland. And here's the market. Well, as the market was going down, Insull was buying. He felt he was immune, and he bought up all the stuff in Indiana and merged it into the Indiana Railroad. So while the market's going to hell, Insull was buying because he thought he was going to get away with it. And he formed the Indiana Railroad. And he combined it into the Midland Utilities. And he bought up Union Traction and went bankrupt. And he bought these for like $3,000. Union Traction and Terre Haute for $3,000. And he merged everything into the Indiana Railroad. And this was very successful. And it was a reduced system. They left out my hometown, got left out. Lafayette got left out. And he parsed it down and made it smaller and was making money. So the Indiana Railroad was Insull's system, took over about 1930. And it left out a lot of people, Crawfordsville and so forth. And it didn't go as many places, but they were making money. And here was one of their ads. Cost you, 2 cents a mile. 1.5 cents if it was a round trip. So the Indiana Railroad system was a going system from 30 to 32. And it's the Louisville Dixie Flyer. And he streamlined these things, bought new cars so that you could get 3 hours, you could get to Louisville, 3.5 you could get to Fort Wayne. And new cars, good service. There's the lounge and high speed. And he's doing a good land office business. Well, the Depression got worse, and Insull got trapped by the New York bankers, and he was forced into bankruptcy. So he went out of business in July of 32. After 2 years of consolidating everything in Indiana, he was forced into bankruptcy. And the banks loved this because during the Depression, everything else fell 60%, and electric utilities fell only 20% because everybody needed electricity. So what happened is we got a new president. We got a new party. Democrats hadn't elected a lot of people since the Civil War. Grover Cleveland, Woodrow Wilson. And but in November, after the market nadired, in July, FDR came in on a sweep. And so we got a new president. And meanwhile, this guy went broke. Insull went broke. He'd been worth $150 million. He was now a $15,000 a year pension, which wouldn't have been bad for most of us in the Depression, but he lost everything. He lost all his assets, and because he used them as collateral to buy new stuff. He thought he was going to get a bargain from all these new acquisitions. Well, Roosevelt, in running for president, decided this was a good guy to attack. That people like Insull were responsible for the Depression. It's these big financiers, and they were playing fast and loose with everybody's money, and they were bad people. And this was part of Roosevelt's campaign in 32. And Insull was bankrupt. New York banks foreclosed. All his property's been pledged. So he lost $150 million. He's reduced to nothing. But he became a campaign item. And so Cook County decided to indict him. And then as soon as FDR took office, he decided he ought to be indicted. So he was indicted by the feds as well, as soon as FDR took office. So, it's lynch Insull. And, well, there's another guy they were going to get rid of. And that was J. Edgar Hoover. They didn't like Hoover. And Senator Walsh was a good Democrat from Montana who was a New Deal man, Roosevelt man. And he was all for FDR. And as you remember, Democrats were all down in Miami hooping it up after the election, after they'd won. And somebody tried to assassinate Roosevelt, and instead they killed who? The mayor of Chicago. Well, everybody's having a good time down there, but as soon as they start shooting, Roosevelt got out. And his buddy here was going to be Attorney General. And damn, I wish I could go back, but I can't. It just won't go back. So Walsh was going to be Attorney General. And won't go back. There you got it somehow. Walsh was going to be Attorney General. And the first thing Walsh and Roosevelt were going to do was get rid of J. Edgar Hoover. He'd only been in since 24, but he was already a pain in the ass. They just knew he was no good. So the first thing they were going to do, Roosevelt was going to appoint his buddy, Senator Walsh, as Attorney General. And the first thing the Attorney General was going to do was fire J. Edgar Hoover. Well, they're all having a good time down in Miami. And Senator Walsh was widowed, 73-year-old widow. And he decided to go over to Havana, where he met this young lady. She was 53-year-old rich widow. And he decided to get married. So he gets back to Miami, and they're going to honeymoon on the Pullman car up to Washington for the inauguration. Well, when the Pullman car pulled into Washington, we had a dead bridegroom. He went the way of Nelson Rockefeller and Errol Flynn. He didn't survive the honeymoon. Poor Senator Walsh died on the way to the inauguration. Meanwhile, Insull had left Chicago because he knew they were out for his scalp. And he's trying to hide in Europe, and Roosevelt sent the Department of Justice for him. Does that sound familiar, that current use of the Department of Justice? So they're over there, and they seize him over there in a Turkish jail, bring him back for trial. Here he is getting out of jail on bail. And here he is, a cartoon in the Chicago Tribune. All these, and guess what? He went to trial, and he was acquitted of everything. Well, meanwhile, the Insull's broke, and so the Indiana Railroad goes into receivership, whatever that means. But it looked like it was the end. But Governor McNutt appointed this guy to look after the railroad, and the railroad did fine. Insull had constructed it such that it was fine. It prospered, actually made a profit. Now, most of these rail lines never made a profit. The reason for the raison d'etre was that the electric companies sold them electricity. So the electric companies financed all the trackage and all the improvements and everything because they could sell their electricity and make a profit to that. But the rail lines by themselves and the streetcars by themselves weren't going to make any money. But the Indiana Railroad did. And here's the terminal in Terre Haute, which still stands. You can go there and get a drink. They had four lines there, 4 track. And so that's Indiana Railroad's doing fine. Meanwhile, the New Deal is going to try and crack down on all these big money guys, and they had at least two programs that affected the railroad. One was the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority. How many people here have heard of the Tennessee Valley? Okay. So this was a great project. It's going to make work for people, and it's going to create hydroelectric power on the Tennessee River for Southern people, and it's going to create a lot of jobs. The trouble was that there were private utility firms supplying electricity down there, but the government was going to do this and make it cheaper and create a lot of jobs, which they needed during the Depression. And the second thing was a Public Utility Holding Act, which we'll get to in a minute. But the private enterprise, Roosevelt was big on this. He wanted this TVA project, Tennessee River, build a bunch of dams. The Tennessee River is like the Nile, for God's sakes. It just goes on and on. It starts in the Smokies and winds all around and ends up in Paducah, Kentucky. But it's a long river, and it was always being flooded. And so they needed a bunch of dams, and it was a great deal. And so they're going to use taxpayer money for this and put the private guys out of business. Private utilities were making too much money, and they're corrupt. And so the government's going to do this. And so this existed. It cost $20 billion in tax dollars. And as Wilkie said, it watered 5 states and drains the nation. But, you know, it had some good things and put people to work. And they finally audited it in 42. And in retrospect, it could have been done cheaper if they'd worked with the private utilities. But at the time, it was a good deal and did a lot of good things and found work for people. And this is the Tennessee Valley, and this is the river. Starts in the Smokies, winds down through Tennessee, and ends up at Paducah. And all these dams, and this was a great public works deal. Here at IU, in 1913, we had these 3 Democrats who were all prominent guys. We had Wilkie, McNutt, and Minton. And they all graduated in 13. Elwood, Martinsville, New Albany. These guys in the Booster Club. And he got his law degree at IU. He got his at Harvard. He got his at IU and then went to Yale. And he was an athlete, lettered in both baseball and football. These guys, he went to France. He stayed stateside, but had the highest rank, major, and he became very active in the American Legion. And he was head of the local American Legion and the state and the national. So he was big in the American Legion and worked for FDR. FDR referred to him as that platinum-haired son of a bitch from Indiana, because McNutt wanted to run for president and wasn't very backing of FDR, so FDR would send him to the Philippines and things and get rid of him. He went on, Minton went on to a great career. He was also in American Legion. He was a senator. And then he got the Supreme Court by Truman. Meanwhile, Wilkie, he actually got to France. Actually, I don't think any of them saw action, and I didn't either, so I can't complain. But he became a Wall Street lawyer and working for a utility company. He became president, making about $75,000 a year in the Depression. And he decided to become a Republican. He thought the New Deal and democratic ideals were wonderful until they affected his pocketbook. And he referred to the New Deal as the new fear. So here's when they were at IU. And here's Wilkie's career. He started out in Akron as a lawyer, but he was in every event, active in Democratic politics, was a delegate to the conventions, nominating committees in 24 and 28, director of boards. And he was brought to New York City by this guy named Cobb, and he was the head of a Power and Light and became president at the same time that Roosevelt was elected. And Roosevelt then started developing these wonderful programs to put people to work. And he ended up, as we know, running for president. Well, in addition to TVA, Roosevelt created the SEC, Securities Exchange, which certainly we need. And he put a sterling character like Joe Kennedy. I mean, this has got to be one of the best decisions you could ever make. He's in charge of this. This is the fox in charge of the hen house, but he's going to chair the SEC. And this is the Public Utility Holding Company Act. And they had these holding companies. They said, what is a holding company? Well, I've been reading about it for months and I don't know, but Will Rogers said a holding company is like when you rob a bank and you take the money and you hand it to a friend to hold for you. And then when the police come to search you, they can't find it because your friend has it. So holding companies were a creation of MBAs and lawyers. And Lord knows what they're shielding, but they were considered to be bad things and not good for the public. And so this holding act was highly contested, and they created the SEC to regulate and break up these utility holding companies, which were multi-state, like we saw about Insull. They're multi-state, 39 states, and 80%, 75% of the industry was controlled by 8 companies, and they were all controlled by J.P. Morgan and the Wall Street banks. And so they wanted to break this up in 32 and break up the electrical system. The Supreme Court okayed it in 38. And so within 10 years, you went from 2,000 of these holding company subsidiaries down to 300. And they were overvalued by $12 billion. And legal challenges went on for 25 years. And a final decision wasn't made until 61 on some of them. And now recently it's been repealed, for God's sake. So it's all beyond me. But the Utilities Act led to the death of the railroad here because all these electric companies had to get rid of the electric transportation companies. And these things can't support themselves. They were supported by the electric power company because the power company was selling them electricity. Well, anyway, the streetcar systems died all over the country. And this was the Indiana Railroad. It was functioning fine, but the rule came down that you had to abandon it. You had 4 years to get rid of it all. And the last car left Indy in 41. And that was the end of the railroad. Here was the death knell of these. Here was Indy to Dayton, Richmond and Dayton. Fort Wayne died, Louisville, and the last one was up to Fort Wayne, 41. So that was the end of the railroad. Well, now, in finishing up, we talk about where we are today. Now we want to replace gasoline, right? We have a problem here, right? So we need to get rid of all these pollutants. And we have people that are going to help us do this. Fortunately, we have people like this in Congress who, and as Elizabeth Warren said, it was not a problem when she grew up on the reservation. And so the Germans, who were bombed to smithereens during the war, their infrastructure was such that they decided to make use of the old streetcars, and they invented the modern light rail. Okay, you say, well, what is light rail? Well, it's like light rail is like being a Gentile. A Gentile is somebody who's not Jewish. Light rail is something that's not heavy rail. So basically, they're super streetcars. And it's the same principle. And they were developed in Germany because after the war, they couldn't build a bunch of new things, so they made use of the old streetcar system. And it started in San Diego and has grown 5 light rails, 13, 17 by 2000, and about 7 new streetcar systems. And now there's about 26. Some streetcars survived World War II, a handful. I don't know if you've been to San Francisco lately. San Francisco at the North Beach area went around and bought a bunch of old streetcars. And it's more of a tourist attraction, I think. But You can ride streetcars in San Francisco, and they have a lot of light rails. I've ridden a lot of these, and they're growing each year. And here's some of them. Now this is heavy rail, rapid transit, and it can be electric and/or electric and diesel. BART is one of them, Bay Area Rapid Transit. I never had the courage to go under the water on that. Anybody here ridden the BART? Good. You didn't drown. You did. It's all right. And that's in the New York subways. Chicago L are old relics. Boston of the old heavy rail. That costs more money. Commuter rail, we still got the South Shore. There's at least 27. The differentiation, commuter rail and heavy rail. These go more miles and have less stops. And there's at least 27 of these now. And Albuquerque to Santa Fe, I've done. That's the most boring trip you'll ever take in your life. 100 miles of sagebrush. It's worthless. Denver to the suburbs, you can do. That's on an old narrow gauge Santa Fe, Rio Grande, Western rail lines, and then they've got one downtown that goes. It's a diagonal. You can go from the hotels down to where the bars are, and then you can get drunk and come back to this without driving. And it's free, and you meet interesting people. I mean, there's the dregs of society there that getting a free ride on that one, but it's free. And then the light rail is growing rapidly, and the streetcars are increasing. And LA is now the leader. They're up 95 miles. Houston's at street level. You get to run into cars all the time, and so it's fun. And this is the big one, LA. It goes everywhere. And they're building more of them. This is from last Saturday's Wall Street Journal. They're putting up, Los Angeles is putting in more. Austin's putting in more light rail. And these are all electric driven. And I've seen dumpsters with more panache, but this is what they look like, but they're functional. This is one of the cars in Los Angeles. Oklahoma City, they're trying it without federal money, with lots of luck, because these are expensive. But a lot of cities putting in their own streetcar systems downtown. And thank you for your attention. Any questions? Rebuttal? Correction? Deletion? Yes, sir. I think you had a station, and they left every hour on most of these routes. Heyday, and millions.
Were they the same gauge?
The I don't know. That's a good question. I should know, and I don't. I don't know about it. Okay.
That makes sense. I think Europe's going big time. My folks used to ride up.
Pharaoh to Indian and up to Frankfurt. And they were, there's a rail club here in town, here in this state, called the Hoosier Traction Company, or Society or whatever. And they meet once a year in Indianapolis the weekend after Labor Day. They'll draw 150 from about 30 some states. So, and a lot of these old boys, they're mostly dead now. But when I started going 20 years ago, they had movies, had home movies of these, because as they were phasing them out, upper middle class folks had movie cameras and color movie cameras and would film the last routes of these things in 39, 40, 41. And one of the guys that founded this Hoosier Traction Club's at Howard Blackburn. And many of you may remember the Transportation Museum in Noblesville. That was a transportation museum that Howard founded. Noblesville threw him out. Noblesville got too genteel for him. But Howard was an enthusiast, and just one story about him, he was still working at age 70. I met him at Terre Haute. He was working full time, and if you know radiologists and how much money they make, most of them are retired at 55 to a villa in the south of France. And so I asked Howard why he was still working. And he said, well, he had expensive hobbies. And I said, girls, drugs, what you know? He said, no, he said, I'm into model trains and model, and I later found out he meant full size. He was buying locomotives and cars. He bought a lot of those locomotives that you used to see at Noblesville. So a couple of years ago at the traction meet, one of his sons from his first marriage gave a nice little biography of him, and people in the audience asked about his wife, his second wife, and children, and there was a silence. And finally, the speaker said, well, Howard was estranged from his family. More silence, and the guy felt obligated, I guess. He said, well, when they went to read the will, there wasn't any money. He'd spent it all on locomotives. Any other comments, questions? Yes, sir.
Was all of the traction system overhead wires?
Yes, it was, yeah.
You know the voltage and was it all compatible?
I think it was all compatible, but I don't know the voltage. Anybody?
What voltage they ran on?
No.
DC?
I don't know. Yeah. Now the modern stuff, they also have the Germans have developed a third rail that you won't electrocute yourself on. They found ways of covering it up so the public doesn't get electrocuted. So some of the newer light rail I've read have a hidden covered third rail. But yeah, it was all ugly wires. And they'd go 70 miles an hour.
I know you're not on to know this, but how comfortable were these early electric trains in the 20s?
Well, I don't think.
No heating or.
Yeah, I think it varied. Yeah, things certainly got better when Insull took over. You know, he made the lounges and he really fixed them up. I think that your hint is right, that a lot of them were uncomfortable and cold, and sometimes they get stranded in the snow, you know, and they weren't luxury travel. But Insull improved that, and so they got better with time. Yes, sir.
Did all the rails have the same gauge?
I believe so, sir, yes.
Was there, back in the 1800s, they built a lot of rails. Was there a standard that they adhered to for the rail gauge?
I think so. I think, you know, you had standard 3 feet something, and then you had a narrow gauge, which was more out west for mountains and things. But I think they used the standard railroad, I don't know, 3'4" or something. Yeah. What is standard? 3'4" or something, or
4, 8.5.
4, 8.5.
You ever hear the story about Dylan sleeping in the car barn in Mooresville?
No. No.
I had a friend of mine who was a gas person, his mother was Dillinger.
Uh-huh.
Of course, Dillinger was kind of a local hero at that time. And there was a car barn there at Mooresville where they stored the interurban. He'd go in there and sleep because nobody went in there and bothered him.
Yeah. That could be. Well, yes, sir.
I remember in downtown, the buses that had overhead electric cars, did they use the same system as
Yes, the interurban companies bought the original buses were owned by the interurban, and as the competition with buses grew, they bought the buses, and then the companies were forced to divest themselves with this Public Utilities Act, and the buses made it. The bus companies then prospered, but the electric didn't.
run completely on electric buses?
I think so. There may have been some hybrid models, but but the bus system prevailed. Yes, sir.
Did Insull have anything to do with inventing the insulator that we see on?
No, he was not an inventor. He was a paper shuffler. Edison, yes, sir.
How much of the divestment that you described was driven by the petroleum industry?
Well, I've not come across that. It was more they wanted to break up the electric utilities. I know we've always heard these rumors that it was General Motors that put these people out of business and so forth and so on, but the New Deal was interested in other things. It was collateral loss, collateral damage that the electric streetcar system died. I have never heard any, it may have been under the table, but there were enough political reasons that they just wanted to control the electric utilities. And it's been a big battle, it's been a big battle, still is. How much government, we have the government runs the mail, they run the mail service, for good, better or worse. We have a health insurance. We don't have a British health system, but we have probably half the populations on Medicare, Medicaid, something, and the government furnished the farmers with electricity, and mail. You couldn't get mail if you were farming. You had to have a box in town, so, you have government versus private, and it's a seesaw, a battle back and forth. And Wilkie was a strong Democrat, but he was against government overreach. He was a good Democrat. He believed in helping all these people and helping the poor and helping the black people and helping the American Indians. And, he was for the underdog and all that. But he also felt that there was an overreach. And we still have that today. We want help from the government. Yes, sir.
It's an interesting observation for those people that think things ought to pay for themselves, like mass transit systems. There is not a single mass transit system by a government in the world that does not require government subsidy. Period.
Yeah, and that's why our rail system's what it is today, because it's not subsidized. And in Europe, you can take the train everywhere, and it is subsidized. And it's interesting that Oklahoma City now, the streetcars, one of the few places, tried to finance it without federal help. Yeah, that's going to be tough, So it's part of the loss of. It's sad that Indiana has had no interest in rejuvenating or revitalizing any of a once significant empire. In fact, at one time, the congressman up there banned any attempts at light rail in Indy. I don't know if you remember that, but that was some years ago.
And it's certainly a truism that had the automobile been built, had been invented 10 or 15 years earlier, there never would have been the urban transportation system.
Well,
Automobile that ultimately ruined the interurban system.
Yes, except that now we still have need for some of this light rail is cropping up everywhere. The last century was the century of the automobile, but the automobile congestion and pollution has now reached the point where we'd rather not have the automobile, at least not burning gasoline. The roads weren't paved here, I guess, according to Madison and his history of Indiana, Professor Madison. We didn't have much in the way of paved roads until after World War I. And so you couldn't get to Bloomington except by train for many years. It was unpaved roads. So we're facing a dilemma now. We can't all afford Teslas. And those batteries are expensive and big, And, you know, we're at a real crossroads. But again, many states are taking, you know, California's really jumped on the bandwagon, as they have on a lot of things. But our state is not interested. We don't even have the train anymore from Indy to Chicago. So nobody here in Indiana has been interested in revitalizing any rail service. Thank you.